I find it very funny that I'm recording the How to Convert Social Media Followers into Podcast Listeners episode right after the episode about why you don't need social media to grow your podcast. But I think that this brings up a very important point. Just because people see you promoting your podcast on social media does not mean they are going to listen to your podcast. Sadly, unfortunately, it's just usually not that easy. And without a dedicated strategy to convert a social media follower to a podcast listener, that transition might never happen. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to optimize your social media profile and content to drive listener traffic, why you have to put yourself in the mind of the content viewer, and how to effectively turn a social media follower into a fan of your podcast. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. All right, so think about the last time you were just mindlessly scrolling on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn. Probably wasn't that long ago. For me, it was about 15 minutes ago. I was working on another podcast and I was just getting kind of sidetracked and I thought, okay, I'm going to just take a break and treat myself to a few minutes of scrolling. And before I knew it, I had to pry myself off the phone and get back to work. For most of us, social media is a distraction. It's a little treat. It's a mental vacation we can go on and just turn off our brain and let someone else drive, right? Normally, when we're on social media, we're letting the algorithm run the show. And whether we're paying attention to it or not, it will just keep serving us up more content, which is kind of a double-edged sword for us podcasters who are hoping that someone will see our content and want to listen to our podcast. On one hand, in this digital age, as we all know, how else would we be pursuing new listeners who weren't explicitly searching for a podcast like ours? It'd be pretty hard, right? I mean, you can get a billboard, or you can take out an ad in a magazine, or you can buy paid ads on Google or Meta, but those are all going to cost you a pretty penny, and especially if you keep running them. And if you're doing this podcast already with money out of your own pocket, that is going to get you even deeper in the hole. So all that being said, we're kind of forced to play the organic social media game. It's not really a choice. I mean, it is, but it isn't if you want this podcast to grow and thrive and fulfill any of the goals that you've created for it. So let's go back to us. And I know that I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but let's go back to us on social media, just scrolling like a brain-dead zombie. Have you ever, in the entirety of you using social media, saw a piece of content that was promoting an episode and left the social media app that you're on, open Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast platform that you're using, and search for that podcast and then started listening to that episode? For me, I can think of very, very, very few times that this has happened. And maybe, which is something that happens to me all the time, I'm on TikTok and I think, oh, I'd love to listen to this episode. And I save it. And guess what? I never go back. I do that all the time. I'll save something that looks interesting that I might want to listen to, but I never go back and check, hey, what was that podcast that I wanted to listen to? Think about how you use social media on a day-to-day basis and how likely you would actually be to go from someone's TikTok or reel or whatever piece of content it may be, open up another app to find that podcast and follow it or listen. That'd have to be a very, very special piece of content, right? And it'd have to really be speaking to you. So why have social media for your podcast at all? When we think about it this way, it seems like, why would we do it? It feels like a huge waste of time. But what I need you to think about and remember is that it takes the average customer 8 to 12 interactions or touch points with a brand to purchase. And a touch point can be the customer seeing an ad or getting an email or seeing their social media content. If it takes 8 to 12 times of someone seeing a product or a brand to spend their money with them, I would say that it takes 8 to 12 times of someone seeing your podcast and them having that touch point with you for them to use their most valuable resource, their time, to listen to your podcast. There is a component of trust that has to be built exactly like between a buyer and a seller with a podcaster and their audience. You aren't asking them to watch a 15-second video. They're not just scrolling around on TikTok. You are asking them to invest minutes, even hours of time with you every week. And for them to make that investment in you, they're first going to have to see the investment you've made in them. Plus, again, if they aren't already searching for a podcast like yours, if you aren't on social media trying to build that awareness, realistically, how are they going to find you? Seriously, if they weren't looking for a podcast like yours, how would they ever find your podcast? People very, very rarely stumble across a podcast that wasn't recommended to them or that they sought out in some shape or form. Let's talk about how to convert followers or viewers through your content. And I know that I've talked about this so many times in so many different episodes, but I'll say it again. Promoting a new episode for the sake of promoting a new episode is not enough. Imagine you opened up your Instagram and someone was promoting their new episode, but they didn't really tell you what it was about and you had never listened to this podcast before. That's an instant skip. Don't care. Zero thoughts. I'm scrolling right past it. Having a new episode isn't impressive. It's the status quo. It's the thing that your listeners are expecting from you. So find a better way to promote your new episodes. This advice is relevant for video or static content, but find the most interesting or valuable part of your episode and find a way to promote that. Leave the person consuming it wanting more. If I'm watching your video, I want to want more and go onto your podcast. Nothing will hook me into content and make me want more than telling me, either literally or figuratively, hey, if you liked this, there's more where this came from, go listen to my podcast. Right off the top of my head, I can think of several historical podcasts that I've started watching because of TikTok that just started by telling a story or basically throwing out a fact like, hey, can you believe XYZ? And it gets me hooked. And then they say, if you want to hear the rest of this story, listen to the full episode on my podcast. And that gets me almost every time because I want to know what happened. But also, I already know that I like this person and I like how they tell stories. And that is just one thing that I think video does a little bit better than static content for podcast conversion from social media specifically, is if someone likes what they are watching in the video, they're already building that trust and curiosity to go to your podcast. Really, the promotional content that you are posting on social media for your podcast should be a hook for the person that's watching it to think, hey, I should continue listening or watching this on their podcast. But in order for that to work, you need to give exact instructions and you need to be clear on what it is that is expected. So in other words, you need a compelling call to action that tells the viewer what to do, how to do it, and why they should do it. Here's an example. Let's say that I have a podcast about being a makeup artist in the wedding industry. And let's say that I decided to make a video about my worst experiences with brides and how I manage them. I'd start with a short form piece of content for social media with something like, you will never believe what happened to me at this wedding. And just start and tell a story. I might tell the whole story and then at the end I'll say something like, if you want to know how I dealt with this situation, or you're a makeup artist in the wedding industry who wants to learn more about how to make money in weddings without losing your cool, listen to XYZ podcast. I have new episodes every Thursday, and you won't believe the other stories on this episode, and maybe just give a quick preview of one of those stories. I mean, if I was a makeup artist that was in the wedding industry and I'm just scrolling and I saw that, that would probably convert me instantly from that social media platform to the podcast to follow, because I'd feel like that was talking to me, like that was directly spoken to me, and now I have an assignment to do. And I think this is where so many podcasters go wrong, because so many times we're posting an aimless clip of our podcast and it's getting nothing because it's giving nothing. Put garbage in, get garbage out. And if you aren't giving someone a direct call to action, good luck on getting them to do anything. I personally think that TikTok and Instagram are the hardest to convert followers to listeners. They also happen to be the most popular social media for people under the age of 40. And I'm saying that it's hard to convert because you can't put a link in the caption or comments. Also, these are both algorithms that are set up to just keep scrolling, an endless loop of just scrolling. So if someone wants to take those extra steps to go on your profile and search for a link or the name of your podcast, this is where you having an optimized profile is a must. You must have a link that's going directly to your podcast from your link in bio. And this can be a direct link, or it can be a link tree, or a link from your website that immediately shows someone where to go. But if you have to take more than 3 steps, you're going to lose them. So when I say 3 steps, I mean like click on your profile, then click on the link, then click on the podcast. That is what I mean by 3 steps. You need to keep it to 3 steps or less, ideally 1 step. Also, make sure that you have the full name of your podcast in your bio. You have no idea how many times that I click on a podcaster's page and their podcast name is nowhere to be found. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to find these people? So make sure that the name of the full name of your podcast is in your bio. Because really, if somebody's not clicking through to that link, how are they going to know what the name of your podcast is? Make sure that you are telling your future listener where to go in your content and that the listener path is crystal clear. People need to know how to get to your podcast with 0 effort. But what about the other social media like Facebook or LinkedIn or even Pinterest or Threads? They make it so much easier because you can put a link in your content. So literally, there is just 1 step that someone has to take to listen to your podcast. Make sure that you are taking advantage of this. Please, please, please. I see podcasters all the time. They're posting about a podcast episode on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever. There's no link to it. That is a huge problem. There are 0 reasons why someone would see you promoting an episode and not have the link right there for them to click and go straight to that episode. And unless you're talking about your full podcast, I would link directly to that episode. So if you're talking about episode 222, make sure that the link is going to episode 222. Don't just send them to your broad podcast. Make it as easy as possible and direct them to the thing that you're talking about. I know that visibility on social media is a fickle friend for your podcast, but my advice to you if you are trying to make more engaging, compelling content is that you are a little bit more aware and intentional when you're on social media. Notice things. Notice what hooks you in. Notice when you get lost in watching something. Save that content so that the next time that you're feeling uninspired, or you're like, oh my gosh, I have to make content today, please, no. You can go back and watch it. Don't copy it, obviously. You are a creator. You know how it feels when someone copies your content and it feels terrible, but study it. Study what you like about it. Study what works and why it works. Try to put yourself in the mind of your future listener. And with every piece of content that you create, ask yourself, would this make me want to listen to this episode? That is huge. And also think about, if I did want to listen to this episode, how many steps would it take me to get there? Also, is it clear that I have a podcast? I think that so many times we get wrapped up thinking that everybody knows everything about us. When I'm scrolling through and I'm thinking, are they a guest on somebody else's podcast? Is this their podcast? What's their podcast name? So make sure that you're making it very clear. This is my podcast. This is the name of my podcast. This is how you can get to my podcast and listen to my podcast. Remember, views don't equal downloads. You need a clear and direct call to action and a clear and direct path to finding your podcast. If you can master those 2 things, you are never going to have to worry about promoting your podcast again. And if you still need help with this and you feel like, oh my gosh, all I do is post on social media about my podcast and nothing is happening, I'm just spinning my wheels. If you want to schedule a social media audit with me where I look through all of your social media and tell you what's working and how you can start converting more followers into listeners, the link is in the episode description. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.